What happens to the men who once commanded millions, who shaped battles that decided the fate of nations? When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, its legendary field marshals, once feared across Europe, found themselves prisoners, outcasts, and in some cases, disgraced. Some stood trial, others vanished into quiet lives, and a few never lived to see peace. But what really happened to them when the Reich fell? Today, we'll uncover the shocking, often tragic stories of Germany's top field marshals after World War II. We start with Wilhelm Keitel. As head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, Keitel was Hitler's loyal yes-man, often mocked by his peers as Lackitel, meaning little lackey. At Nuremberg, he was indicted for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and waging aggressive war. Unlike some, Keitel didn't try to deny his role. He admitted obedience to Hitler above all else, famously declaring that he had sworn an oath of loyalty. The tribunal sentenced him to death. On October 16, 1946, Keitel was hanged at Nuremberg, one of the few field marshals to be executed for his part in the war. Next, Albert Kesselring. Known as Smiling Albert, he was Germany's top commander in Italy, masterminding defensive battles that delayed the Allies for months. After the war, the British put him on trial for war crimes related to civilian massacres and deportations in Italy. In 1947, he was sentenced to death, but international pressure and shifting politics saw his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. By 1952, he was released on health grounds, supposedly close to death. Ironically, he lived another 8 years, writing memoirs and remaining unrepentant, insisting German soldiers had fought honorably. Then we have Erich von Manstein. Perhaps Germany's most brilliant strategist, Manstein designed the plan that crushed France in 1940 and later commanded armies on the Eastern Front. Captured by the British in 1945, he faced trial in Hamburg in 1949. Unlike Keitel, he was tried not for high-level crimes against peace, but for specific atrocities, such as executing Soviet commissars and deporting civilians. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, reduced to 12, but was released in 1953 after only 4 years, partly thanks to support from figures like Winston Churchill, who admired his military genius. Manstein later advised the newly formed West German Bundeswehr before dying in 1973. Now to Ferdinand Schörner. Nicknamed Bloody Ferdinand by his men, Schörner was infamous for brutality, executing his own soldiers for retreating and enforcing Hitler's no-surrender orders. In May 1945, as Germany collapsed, he deserted his post as commander-in-chief of the German army, fleeing to Bavaria in civilian clothes. Captured by American forces, he was handed over to the Soviets, who sentenced him to 25 years for war crimes. Later transferred back to West Germany, he served time for Nazi-era executions. Released in 1963, he lived quietly in Munich until his death in 1973. Let's turn to Walter Model, a master of defensive warfare. Model earned the nickname Hitler's fireman for stabilizing collapsing fronts. But by April 1945, he commanded Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket, encircled by Allied forces. Realizing the war was lost and unwilling to stand trial, Model told his officers he would not be part of the surrender. On April 21, 1945, he walked into the woods near Duisburg and shot himself. His body was found days later, one of the highest-ranking suicides in the German military. Now, Fedor von Bock. Bock had commanded Army Group Center during Operation Barbarossa and had a reputation as a competent but cautious general. After Hitler dismissed him in 1942, he faded into the background. At war's end, Bock wasn't tried at Nuremberg. He was essentially sidelined. But in May 1945, while fleeing advancing Soviet troops, his car was strafed by a Soviet fighter plane near Hamburg. He was killed instantly, making him one of the few field marshals to die in combat-related action after Germany's collapse. Next is Erhard Milch. Not a field marshal of the army, but of the Luftwaffe, Milch was Göring's deputy in the Air Force and heavily involved in the use of slave labor for aircraft production. Captured by the Allies, he was tried at Nuremberg in the Milch trial, one of the 12 subsequent trials. Found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Yet he was released in 1954 after serving just 9 years. Milch lived out his life in Düsseldorf, dying in 1972. Now to Walther von Reichenau. A committed Nazi among the officer corps, Reichenau was one of the few generals to embrace Hitler's ideology fully. He issued the infamous Severity Order, calling for ruthless treatment of Soviet civilians and Jews. But his fate was unusual. He never faced Allied justice. In early 1942, he suffered a stroke on the Eastern Front. Evacuated by aircraft, he died during the journey, possibly from a heart attack or from injuries after his plane crash-landed. His death spared him the Nuremberg dock, though his orders left a lasting stain. Gerd von Rundstedt deserves mention. One of Germany's most senior commanders, Rundstedt held key posts in France and Russia. Captured by the Americans in 1945, he was considered too old and infirm to stand trial. In fact, his doctors warned that prison conditions would likely kill him. Instead, he was released in 1948 on health grounds and retired quietly. He died in 1953, largely forgotten compared to his more infamous colleagues. Then there's Hugo Sperrle, a Luftwaffe field marshal. Sperrle commanded air fleets during the Battle of Britain and later in the Mediterranean. Captured by the Allies, he stood trial in Nuremberg but, unlike Milch, was acquitted of all charges. After the trial, Sperrle returned to Germany, living in relative obscurity. He died in 1953, his reputation as an air commander overshadowed by the Luftwaffe's failures. Next up, Wilhelm List. List had commanded Army Group A during the invasion of the Soviet Union, leading forces into the Caucasus. After the war, he faced trial at Nuremberg in the hostages trial, charged with atrocities in the Balkans, including the mass execution of civilians. Sentenced to life imprisonment, he was released in 1952 on medical grounds, supposedly near death. But he lived another 6 years, dying peacefully in 1971. Günther von Kluge is another story of suicide. Commanding Army Group Center during the Great Soviet Offensives, Kluge was implicated, though not directly involved, in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944. Recalled from the front and pressured by Hitler's suspicions, Kluge took poison in August 1944 while traveling back to Germany. His death occurred before the war's end, but his downfall shows how paranoia consumed even the highest ranks. Walther von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army until late 1941, also avoided post-war trials, though not by choice. He had been dismissed by Hitler after the Moscow offensive failed. In 1948, while awaiting trial for war crimes, he died in a British military hospital. His death spared him from possible conviction. And finally, Hermann Göring, not technically a field marshal, but Reichsmarschall, the highest rank in the German armed forces. Tried at Nuremberg, he was sentenced to death for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But on the eve of his execution in October 1946, Göring cheated the hangman, swallowing a cyanide capsule in his cell. His suicide shocked the Allies, raising questions about how he had obtained the poison. So what became of Germany's field marshals after World War II? Their fates ranged from the gallows at Nuremberg to prison cells to quiet retirements, and in many cases, to suicide. Some went to their graves unrepentant, others tried to reshape their legacies, and a few escaped justice altogether. These men once stood at the pinnacle of power, commanding vast armies. But in the end, the collapse of the Third Reich reduced them to fugitives, prisoners, and relics of a disastrous cause. Now, I want to hear from you. Whose fate surprised you the most? Was it Keitel's hanging, Manstein's release, or Göring's final act of defiance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this dive into history fascinating, don't forget to hit like, share this with others, subscribe for more, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next deep look into the past.